Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 11 of our course of Introduction to Korean History. And this is one of the saddest chapters of Korean history, from 1931 to 1945 under the Japanese occupation, what some would call the forced Japanization of Korea. Ending finally in Japan's defeat at the end of World War II. The period begins in 1931, where we left off last week. If you remember, Japan absorbed Manchuria. They renamed it, they called it the independent country of Manchukuo, but it was definitely Japanese occupied Manchuria. But the result of that event in 1931 was that Korea was now seen as an integral part of the Japanese imperial machinery. And so there was no way for Korea to wiggle out of any of the process of Japanizing, you might call it, that began to pick up steam during this period as Japan came to see its very existence dependent on confronting increasingly militarily the great powers of the world, especially the United States. As a result of the events of 1931, as Japan absorbed portions of what was seen as China at the time, many of the Western nations now began to back away from Japan because they started to realize or feel that Japan was getting too big for its britches, so to speak, in the world in terms of its imperial ambitions. And so in the League of Nations and others involved in quote unquote peacemaking and international relations during the period, they started to seek to isolate Japan. And Japan's answer to this was to turn inward, very similar to what we see happening nowadays with Russia in its experience in Ukraine. As Russia finds itself isolated, it's creating a new constellation of its own making. And that's exactly what Japan was doing. And so in that process, almost without thinking, Japan sought to completely absorb Korea into its machinery. And so Korea now was the staging ground for Japanese conquest, moving further into East Asia, into parts of China. And as the kind of machinery took over in Korea itself, in the Korean Peninsula, as we mentioned briefly in the last period, you probably noticed in your readings, the resistance, both ideological and armed resistance against the Japanese, moved to Manchuria and parts beyond into the frontiers and portions of China. And so you had a situation there where communists and dissidents of all sorts, along with Korean freedom fighters, were mixing and rubbing elbows and sharing notes and comparing information. And one of the young men who became a military leader leading a guerrilla group in the resistance against the Japanese was a young Korean man named Kim Il-sung, who had been the child of Christian elders in a church in Pyongyang, and now found himself in the mountains shoulder to shoulder with communist insurgents fighting against both the national Chinese government and the Japanese occupation. And so Kim Il-sung starts his journey that would eventually lead him toward becoming the first leader of North Korea. That's a subject for much later. But this is when he got his start in the 1930s in Manchuria, resisting the Japanese. Korean labor was now forcibly integrated into the Japanese imperial system. Now, there were quite a few Koreans. When there is an occupation, there are a variety of strategies for dealing with the occupation. In our American movies, the people always resist to the point of death when something comes along. That's actually not a very good strategy when you're being occupied by a foreign power. A better strategy is to roll with it and see how you and your family and your community can survive. And one of the survival strategies is to take your medicine and go with the program for the moment. And that's what a lot of Koreans did. Um, there were others who, of course, like we mentioned, were militarily resisting the Japanese. But quite a few were not in a position to resist militarily. They wanted to live. They wanted their family members to live, and they wanted a better life for their children and their grandchildren. And so they sought to cooperate or adjust themselves to the new reality in whatever sense. Some of the young men sought openly a career in the Japanese military when those options opened up, and they quickly became officers and even generals in the Japanese army. So you have to think that when World War II happens, when United States and the other allies are fighting the Japanese from island to island, they're also fighting Koreans, they're also fighting Indonesians and Chinese, other groups of people that were assimilated or conscripted into the Japanese army, especially by the late 1930s. 1938, of course, that was the official time when Koreans were being integrated into the Japanese army, first voluntarily and then later conscripted in mass as they just needed rifles on the line going towards resisting the Allied onslaught as the Allies moved from island to island in the direction of Japan. But that's later once the war is openly declared after 1941. By 1940, the Korean culture was being transformed. So you have to think about this. We're basically talking about a decade, 1931 to 1941, the declaration of war, the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. In a 10-year period, Korean culture is completely forcibly transformed in a way that we cannot imagine, probably in our own realities. Um, we mentioned Korean labor being conscripted, um, soldiers, young men being forced to fight in the military. In the 1940s, schools from kindergarten up are now taught in Japanese. And so you're being taught you are a citizen of the Japanese Empire. You're not being taught you're a Korean when you're in kindergarten. You're being taught you are a loyal citizen of the Japanese empire, beholden to the emperor of Japan. So it's a complete paradigm shift that's now enforced beginning from kindergarten, elementary school, middle school, all the way up, starting in the 1940s, around 1940. Government offices now exclusively use Japanese as their language of business. Banks and companies, businesses are required to keep records only in Japanese. So basically, if you don't use Japanese, you're being left out of any form of advancement, education, employment. So there weren't too many people that were living in Korea that were in a position to resist this openly. Um, Also, by 1935, a kind of religious transformation is happening as well, because students and government employees starting in 1935 are required to attend Shinto ceremonies, basically the national religion of Japan, the imperial religion of Japan. And part of the rites of Shinto are to bow to the emperor. Now, if you are not a very religious person, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, you're now part of the Japanese Empire. That might not seem like a big deal compared to everything else you have to do. But for many religiously minded people, especially Christians who had been converted by the foreign missionaries and had begun now a multitude of Korean churches and schools and hospitals, throughout Korea, this was not acceptable. This was idolatry. This was betrayal of your religion. And so it turned out that Christians who had been trained by the foreign missionaries from the United States and England and other countries, Germany, Russia, those Christians led the indigenous resistance against this process. And there were schools that were forcibly closed. And within a couple of years, Japan forcibly um, exiles and kicks out all of the Western missionaries from Korea, who are now seen as a foreign negative influence within the Japanese empire in Korea. So that process is also taking place at the same time. Koreans during this time were also encouraged to change their surnames to a Japanese style. So to make their names more Japanese sounding. And so Japanized Korean surnames come into vogue during this period. And in some cases, in many cases, people are forcibly at birth given Japanese names and titles. But there was still a very clear distinction between a native born Japanese and a native born Korean who was being Japanized, and the same with other of the East Asian nations that were being absorbed into the Japanese empire. They were kind of half Japanese and therefore half human, but they were not fully accepted as part of the Japanese system. There was still a glass ceiling between any other ethnic group and native Japanese. This was also reflected in the pay scale, that workers, even farmers, would be paid less than half of the same pay rate as a Japanese farmer doing the same work on the same farm. Less than 50% would be a Korean rate. And many of the other nations being ingratiated or integrated into the Japanese experience were paid even less than the Koreans. The Koreans were seen by the Japanese as one step below Japan, and the others were far below. And so, in that sense, Korea had a privileged position. But given the fact that you have lost your sovereignty and you're losing your culture, you're losing your language, it's not a good trade-off as far as the Koreans are concerned. And probably the worst development during this period in the 1930s is that of what came to be called as the Comfort Corps, as if it were an army or a service unit of the military. And basically, this was forced prostitution in mass systematically by the Japanese army as a strategy to limit the rapes taking place as the Japanese took over these lands, to prevent the conflict and hostility with the lands being integrated. They, in some cases, conscripted, hired, and in many cases, kidnapped and forced into paid prostitution women from all over this part of Asia, especially Korea. The vast number of the women in the Comfort Corps were Korean women. And the illusion that was often projected was that they were there by choice, when in fact, the Japanese were going around with trucks and rounding up young women and just basically kidnapping them. Or they get on a ship headed for Japan thinking they were going to a factory, and they'd be picked up by a truck that would take them to a plane that would fly them to someplace in China where they would be housed at a comfort station and forced to service the soldiers for many hours a day. Unbelievably horrible conditions. And this is something that continues to be struggled with even today. It wasn't until the 1980s, the late 80s, that clear efforts were made to announce and just decry this horrible crime that took place for decades. Unfortunately, it did not immediately come to an end at the loss of the Japanese at the end of World War II, but we'll discuss some of the reasons why it was actually continued for years and years beyond Japanese loss at the end of World War II. But this is a huge sticking point. And it wasn't until 1995 where the Japanese government finally officially apologized, especially to Korea, for the women that were forced to serve in this way. They denied it for the longest time. But even for many, it seems like too little, too late. And even nowadays, the last of the surviving comfort women are passing away. They're in their late, they're in their 90s and even in their early hundreds of age. And so they're passing away at this time, but still hoping for justice until their last moments of life. Korea developed, in a sense, during the Japanese occupation period. Railroads, bridges, telegraph lines, businesses were modernized, and actually a lot of the military development was moved to Korea to avoid the bombing campaigns the Allies were carrying out constantly over Japan. And so the planes that were, being piloted by the kamikaze pilots attacking ships in the Pacific, many of those planes were being constructed right outside of Seoul. The bullets were and the shells were being made in Korea. The soldiers were being conscripted in Korea. The ships were being built in Korea. So a lot of the Japanese war machine was highly dependent on the resources of Korea. And so I refer to it as the period of exploitation because Korea was systematically exploited. Almost every tree in the entire peninsula was harvested for military materials. And the list goes on and on. The country was modernized, but Koreans could not control their own destiny. Over 1 million Koreans were forced to serve the Japanese war machine, whether as conscripted laborers, as soldiers, or as prostitutes to the Japanese troops. So just getting your head around this period of history might help you understand the lasting animosity, even up to the present day, between the Japanese and the Koreans. In fact, in the past week, in 2023, as I record this, the president of Korea made a visit to Japan in which he, without thinking, bowed before the Japanese flag. And that created an outcry in Korea. People still remember what they were forced to do during this period of exploitation. And so it's a very sad period of time in Korea's history. And on the other hand, this forced modernization prepared Korea after the close of World War II to begin to modernize and develop and industrialize at a pace far outstripping any other country in Asia. And so it's a horrible experience that caused inhuman conditions for so many people. But on the other side, it laid the groundwork for the future development of Korea. So that's what I'd like to help you to understand during this period. And the readings are not easy, but I hope you will take a look at them. And I hope the other supplemental resources will assist you as you study this period.